All right, so we're going to start the second portion of this unit, which is the Cold War. And for this lecture, we're going to focus solely on 1945 to 1950, the very beginning of the Cold War, and the earliest policies, US policies related to the Cold War. So first, we're going to just kind of get into a brief review of the aftermath of World War II. So first of all, we have the atomic bomb. The United States used the atomic bomb in World War II against Japan, and this created the nuclear age, but it also established us as the most powerful military in the world. And it gave us a lot of leverage. Other countries wouldn't mess with us because we had this weapon that could destroy a city. And so they were on edge with the way that we handled things, and maybe a little bit more reserved or hesitant to challenge us. And this is a big deal for us. And so entering into the Cold War, we have this leverage that no other country, including the Soviet Union, has. A lot of the aftermath of World War II was trying to fix the problems that we had gotten ourselves into following World War I. So part of that was not punishing Germany. We mentioned this already in World War II, but you see that we divided up Germany and Berlin with France and Britain and the Soviet Union, and we were, for our part, we were trying to rebuild and restore Germany. The Soviets are not going to be doing that, so that's going to create part of the division. In Japan, we had gotten an unconditional surrender, and we placed General Douglas MacArthur in charge of rebuilding Japan in our image. So they're going to, we're going to be their military. We're going to recreate their economy. We're going to make them a democracy. We're going to make them an ally. So we don't want to punish Japan either. We want to make them on our side and create a foothold in Asia. And that's going to be the mission, and that's going to be the goal. The United Nations is established, and this is, again, a fix for what we didn't accomplish following World War I. The League of Nations was scrapped, which ultimately was a factor in leading to World War II. And so we're going to try to prevent that from happening. We are now part of the world. We are now a world leader. We are going to be a founding member of the United Nations. And again, the main goal is to prevent war and to create peace in the world and be kind of an arbiter of justice. The Soviet Union went back on their promise to leave Eastern European countries. And this is going to be, again, a leading cause of the tension that leads into the Cold War, because they're not following through on what they promised. It looks like they're trying to take over Europe, so it's going to be problematic. So that's generally what was happening immediately when the war ended, and we usher in this Cold War. Now, the definition of a Cold War, we've only had one Cold War, so there it is. You could basically put in the United States and the Soviet Union had no large-scale direct fighting between each other. Instead, we didn't trust one another. We spied on one another. We used propaganda to make the other look like, like the country was falling apart, like they were, we were demons, like on both sides. That we were just like not good people, and we deceived one another in a lot of ways throughout this time period. But we didn't fight one another directly. Instead, we used proxy wars. So all the hot spots of the Cold War, we just helped fund or took part in. So, for example, like Vietnam, and for Vietnam, for us, we went to fight in Vietnam. Soviet Union didn't, but they backed the Viet Cong. The Soviet Union went into Afghanistan to fight. We didn't go in to fight in Afghanistan, but we backed the Mujahideen who were fighting against the Soviets. So it could be a civil war where one side is a communist power, one side is a democratic power, and they're fighting to see, is this country going to be communist or democratic? We would support the democratic forces. They would support the communist forces with money and weapons and advisors, and they would battle it out to see who would win. So this is the way that this war was fought. It was unconventional. It never had really happened like this before. So here's a map of all the hotspots around the world. And as you can see, in the Cold War, there were proxy wars or hotspots in Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Europe, in South America, in Central America, the Caribbean, all over the place. The two places that they were not, the United States, the Soviet Union, well, and Canada, but Canada tried to stay out of it as much as they possibly could. But this is an example of how these hotspots were all around the globe. We did not directly fight the Soviet Union. Okay, so let's get through some Cold War leaders now. This is from 1945 to 1950. The first one is Joseph Stalin. You can see this quote over here by Stalin. Ultimately, Stalin was distrustful of the United States and Great Britain, which led to a lot of the tension of the Cold War. And so Stalin is going to be, the driving force behind trying to, in his mind, the democracy was pushing towards them. So if we're looking at it from their perspective, they saw democracy as a threat, and we saw communism as a threat. So both sides kind of viewed each other's policies or ways of life as not the correct way to go about things. So here is Joseph Stalin and his perspective following World War II. Winston Churchill, not the prime minister at the time, between 1945 and 1950, but he was a leading proponent of trying to stop the communist expansion in Europe. He coined the term the Iron Curtain. This white line here is the Iron Curtain. And as you see, it looks like these communist countries are just pushing across Europe. And that was his fear, that all of these countries would eventually fall to communism. Now that was a real fear because there were communist sympathizers in all of these countries after World War II. And they felt that capitalism once again failed them, and that democracy had failed. And so there really wasn't it was touch and go as far as that was concerned. So Churchill wasn't trying to create too much hysteria. It was pretty evident that they needed to be vigilant in order to make sure that communism wouldn't spread. So that's where he was coming from. So Winston Churchill, and he'll actually come back as prime minister in 1950. So he will be back on the scene in the 50s. Harry Truman took over for FDR from World War II. He is the U.S. president. This is the U.S. perspective following World War II. And his policies are going to be the policies of containment too. So how are we going to work to stop the spread of communism in Europe? And a lot of the actions that he does as president all revolve around that. So in 1949, we start to see mutual defense treaties form. The first, on the Western or democratic side, NATO is established. We still have NATO today. Member countries are pretty much the same as what they were before. And these are all the green countries. These are the NATO countries. The red countries are the Warsaw Pact. They are also a mutual defense treaty. That was made up of the communist countries. And again, World War I, we had secret alliances. We didn't know who would come in to help a country if we attacked that country. But now, with these mutual defense treaties, they were out in the open. They were public knowledge. So the Soviets knew that they couldn't attack NATO countries. NATO countries knew they couldn't attack Warsaw Pact countries. Because if you did, it could lead to a nuclear war, or at least World War III. So again, that's why a lot of these proxy wars were fought, and not many were fought really in this part of Europe. None were fought. Because of the fear that if you did any assault on one of these countries, that it would become a larger war. So mutual defense treaties. So Harry Truman and his advisors, their goal was to, again, contain communism. And so there are a few ways that they do that. So first of all, containment is keeping the existing boundaries and not allowing Soviet influence to spread. Well, how do we do that? Well, the first one is the Truman Doctrine. The first one we're going to talk about is the Truman Doctrine. And this was Truman's policy to give economic and military aid to countries that were in danger of becoming a communist nation. So, for example, Greece and Turkey are primarily where this occurred. They both had uprisings, communist uprisings. We supported the democratic powers in Greece and in Turkey. You see these dollar signs. We gave money and weapons to these countries to fight off communist influence. So that becomes the Truman Doctrine. And this doctrine will carry throughout the Cold War. And I would maybe even say today, like this is still a policy that we give weapons and money to countries that we support. Even though we're not in the Cold War anymore, we still have the same type of interests that we did during the Cold War. So the Truman Doctrine basically is still in play. The Marshall Plan is an element of the Truman Doctrine, except for, we're not giving weapons, but we're giving money. And this was primarily focused on Europe. As you see, Great Britain got a huge stack of money, and so did France. And a lot of these other countries, West Germany and the Netherlands and Belgium and Italy, Austria, these countries were the ones that were most war-torn by World War II, and they were the ones that were most threatened by the potential communist influence. And so the Marshall Plan is actually a containment policy. We give money to rebuild these countries, rebuild farmlands, rebuild cities, towns, get governments back on their feet so that they can reestablish democratic governments. People can have jobs again. They can be, feel stable so they're not swayed towards those more radical influences. Excuse me. But these countries didn't become communist, but they did adopt a lot of socialist elements following World War II, because again, they felt that capitalism had failed them, and democracy was kind of not really, was fragile. So they did keep democracy, but they bring in elements of socialism to try to make sure that more people have basic necessities met. So the Marshall Plan allowed them to do that. It contained or stopped the spread of communism. One of the major conflicts, though, of this time period was the Berlin airlift. So as you see, this is how Germany was divided. Here is the Soviet territory, the US territory, the French territory, and the Great Britain or British territory. And here's Berlin, like all the way over in this Soviet territory. And down here, this is where how Berlin was divided, the very same way that the larger country was divided. So West Berlin, so this half of this dot, is democratic Western influence. The rest is all communism. And so people who lived in West Berlin, in West Germany, had a much different experience, East Berlin and East Germany had a much different experience than the people who lived in West Berlin and West Germany. And we were rebuilding West Germany and West Berlin and trying to get them back on their feet. The Soviets were pillaging those parts of the country and punishing the Germans for what they had done in World War II. And Stalin did not like these elements that were in West Berlin. He wanted this all to be communist. So he cuts off access to East Germany, and in particular West Berlin, for a whole year. And this is the blockade of Berlin. Now we had a couple of possibilities. We could just go to war with the Soviet Union, but that didn't seem like a real, possible thing or thing that anyone would want to do after World War II. So Truman felt that we should still try to keep this little island of democracy. And so he decides that we're going to break this blockade, and we start flying planes with supplies into West Germany. I keep saying that, into West Berlin. And the Soviets knew that if they shot down any of our planes, that we had the atomic bomb, and this could be a bad thing for them. So they may have they did some mortar rounds towards the planes initially. They threatened us, but nothing physical. They didn't actually attack us. And we do this for a year. And after a year, Stalin realizes this is not going to work, and he calls it off. and West Berlin is able to continue going on. It thrives, and it's kind of this beacon of like possibility in the midst of all this communism that is going on. So the Berlin airlift was a win, an early win for the United States. 1949, though, changes everything. And there are two events that happened in 1949 which make it a lot more difficult for us to operate in the world. The first is the Communist Revolution in China. And we see, apparently lost the A over here, but the Communist Revolution creates China as a communist country, and one of the largest countries of the world is now communist. An Asian country is now communist. And it seems like communism is now spreading through Asia. And as a result, we, the United States, do not recognize this new communist government. And Mao Zedong, who is now the leader of China, we recognize Chiang Kai-shek and the government that escaped into Taiwan as the legitimate government. And so this creates a lot of tension between the United States and China. And the Soviet Union, again, now it looks like we've got this other enemy to deal with. China and the Soviet Union, this huge landmass that is now communist. So that poses a problem for us. The second major event of 1949 was the Soviet Union tests an atomic bomb. Catches us by surprise. How did they get this information? The Manhattan Project was top secret. We detonated the two bombs we had made in World War II. So some way they had found this information. And so we, possibility of spies in the United States, that freaked people out. On top of that, we lose our military advantage. Now they have the bomb. And so this evens things out in ways. Now, like if this would have happened during the Berlin airlift, we may not have flown those planes in because we could have caused a nuclear war. But now we're going to have to be a lot more careful about how we operate with the Soviet Union. And it also marks the beginning of the arms race. And so now, they have the bomb. We're going to have two bombs. We have two bombs. They're going to have 5 bombs, and then we're going to have 8 bombs. And then we're just going to have to make more and more of these weapons, and then make them more powerful. So like technology is going to like balloon. We're going to have hydrogen bombs and all these different types of bombs that are much bigger than what was created that was dropped on Japan. Oops. So, for example, here's a chart of the arms race. You see that in 1949, they have a few, and then we just start to take off. Throughout the 50s, we go from having a couple, maybe 100, upwards of 5,000, all the way up to a peak of over 30,000 nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union's peak comes much later, but they eventually will, in the 1980s, get over almost 45,000 nuclear warheads. So this is what starts in 1949. Again, you can see here, these are tests that the US and the Soviet Union did. So you can see these periods of intense testing of nuclear and atomic bombs. And this is for the duration of the Cold War. So the 1945 to 1950 clearly creates this time period where kind of cements the beginning of the Cold War. In terms of policy, in terms of territories that are mapped out, in terms of mutual defense treaties, who's on whose side, and it kind of all ushers in the events that will come in the next lecture on the 1950s. Thanks a lot.